Chapter 2: The Attributes of God. Before we discuss God's qualities, it is necessary to understand some of the limitations facing us when discussing such a grand subject. Our mind, as science tells us, is a finite entity. This means it has limits. It has a beginning and an end. It can only do so much, and then it can do no more. For example, we can multiply figures in our mind without the assistance of paper and pencil. But we can do so only up to a certain point before we become frustrated. We can hear sounds only in specific frequency ranges, although the sound spectrum extends above and below our audible range. We cannot perceive the presence of X-rays, infrared, or ultraviolet rays. But this does not mean that they do not exist. Rather, it shows that we are unable to verify their existence through our senses. At this very moment, we are being bombarded by radio waves from local broadcasting stations, but we cannot verify their existence until we tune into their frequency by means of a specially designed receiver. Few of us would be foolish enough to deny the existence of radio and television transmissions simply because we cannot hear them unaided through our senses. We have thus come across an important principle of life, which applies equally to mysticism. There are things which exist that cannot be perceived by the senses. In discussing God, we must recognize that all great religious masters have said that God is infinite. This means that He is without limitation of any kind. Our problem is basically this: how does a finite entity, the mind, comprehend something infinite like God? It is obvious that we have run into a rather severe problem. How can the mind understand something which is greater than itself? And, furthermore, religion tells us God is beyond time and space, beyond petty concepts of good and evil, and can never be fully understood by the human mind. This, then, is our problem. We try to discuss God with our limited mind, recognizing that although we can get a small glimpse of His greatness and His plan, we can never truly understand it. Do try to remember as you read this book that it may not be possible to explain every single concept in detail, as there are no words to convey experience which goes beyond the realm of mind and matter. After all, where is the source of all words if not the mind? Since words are of the mind, they cannot convey a reality higher than that experienced by the mind. With this point firmly fixed in our awareness, we can attempt through words to feed the mind spiritual insights from which it can profit. What are the characteristics of God? When we study the writings of the saints, we find that God is described by certain attributes. We are told that He is comprised of omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, love. Omniscience means that God knows all there is to know. In fact, as He has created everything which we see, He is, in reality, the creator of knowledge itself. Now, what does omniscience really mean? It means that there is nothing unknown to God. If we call a certain power God, and it knows everything, with the exception of one small fact, then that power cannot be called omniscient. It can be a very great power, a very wise power. It can have far more knowledge than you or I, but it cannot be omniscient, for it has something less than total knowledge. The Lord for whom we search must truly be an all-knowing power. He must possess the knowledge which includes all other knowledge. Why must God know everything? The answer is not too difficult to understand. Let us start by examining ourselves. We, as human beings, are at the top of the creation as far as this material world is concerned. There is no other creature which is as clever as man and which comes anywhere near his intellectual ability. If we simply look at our physical body, then we are hardly superior to some of the lower animals. Some can run faster, others can jump higher, or climb and swim with more grace and speed. We can hardly compete with a fish in the water, nor can we fly unencumbered like a bird. Where then rests our superiority? If longevity itself were the criterion, the redwood tree with its 5,000-year lifespan might be a better model. Yet which one of us would rather be an unconscious, though long-living redwood tree? Obviously, if it is not our physical superiority, there must be some other criteria for our superiority. We are conscious beings. We seem to have a greater quantity and different quality of consciousness. No other animal has this quality which enables mankind to inquire, reason, and seek enlightenment. We can devote many hours to reading a book about consciousness itself. Which other animal can do that? We would hardly exchange our place with a lower animal lacking this vital quality of consciousness, Akash. If consciousness is our greatest asset, and it is this very ability which has enabled us to have dominion over this world, then it is only logical to conclude that God must certainly be an entity whose consciousness is at least on par with that of a human. If he had less awareness than you or I, he would hardly be worth worshipping. We might as well worship one another or turn to the animals and plants, as some people have done. No, our own mind will tell us logically that any superior power must certainly have consciousness, and must have far more of it than we do to be reckoned a superior power. All that we know has come from our awareness or consciousness. What could we learn or what could we know if we were unconscious? People have been in comas in the hospital for weeks. When they awaken, they tell us that the last thing they remember is the time just before they became unconscious. The time between the injury and the regaining of consciousness is lost to them. They cannot remember anything about the coma period. They know neither how much time has gone by, nor anything about the extensive care they received. You see, they were unconscious. That is, their consciousness had been reduced to a level below the waking state. So how can we imagine God to have less consciousness than we have? And if he is truly omniscient, he must be consciousness personified. If there were any conscious being higher than he, it would have to be some kind of superior or higher ranking God. So why not worship the higher one instead? Obviously, if consciousness distinguishes one creature from another, and if man, by virtue of his superior consciousness, is the highest creature on this plane, then some superior being must be higher up on the ladder in terms of awareness or consciousness. And certainly the one whom we call Lord must be the supreme form of that consciousness, for what could be higher than the true Lord? If God did not know everything, then there is some information which we would need to obtain at some other source. This implies that there is a power having knowledge that God himself does not have. It would be ludicrous to call a being the true Lord when he lacks all knowledge. In Sant Matthew 6:32, Christ tells his disciples, "For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things." It is obvious that Christ is telling us that there is nothing we can call to God's attention, for he already knows everything. He knows our every need even before we ask. So Christ says, it is foolish to ask God to satisfy our worldly needs. Omnipresence means that God is present in every part and particle of the creation. There is not one speck of the creation which is devoid of God. In order to be truly omnipresent, the power which we call God must dwell in every crevice of the universe. This also relates to his omniscience, for he would need to be everywhere in order to know everything. If we can escape from the being we call God by hiding in some remote outpost in the creation, we can conclude that we have not found the Supreme Father, for he must be everywhere. If God is everywhere, in every particle of the creation, It is obvious that he also resides within every one of us. For are we not also part of the creation? We exist, so an omnipresent God must also be present within every one of us. If he does not inhabit my body, he is hardly omnipresent. Yet look at how many of us search the far corners of the globe in search of God. As the poet Tennyson has proclaimed, "Speak to him, thou, for he hears, and spirit with spirit can meet. Closer is he than breathing, and nearer than hands and feet." Our efforts are directed toward discovering him outside ourselves, but we never think to look for his kingdom within. An ancient adage says, "The way out is in." This is a very important part of the mystic path of Sant Mat, for it gives us a clue as to where we must ultimately search in order to find him. The principle is simple. The Lord whom we seek is not to be found anywhere outside. He must be realized within the human body. Once we have realized him within ourselves, we will find that he is also everywhere within this creation. Saints advise us that it is not possible to see the Lord in the creation unless we have first found him within our own being. Next, we come to the attribute of omnipotence. This means that the Lord whom we seek must be the ultimate power. There can be no other power greater than his. Neti, neti, cries the Hindu, meaning not this, not that. However you try to describe God's power, he is beyond that feeble description. If there were any way in which a being could perform better than God, that being would be superior to the God we had found, and, once again, would be more worthy of our love and devotion. Why follow a captain if you can keep company with a general? Further, since he is the ultimate power, his will must prevail in all matters. From his vantage point, there can be no activity taking place in the creation without his sanction. As the ultimate power, he must be in control of the creation. If his creation, as some assert, has slipped from his control, he could hardly be termed the all-powerful being. For example, some people seriously debate whether the negative power, or devil, could one day assert himself over God and take over the creation and its inhabitants, independent of God's will. How can this be? If, as all masters and saints have declared, this creation which we see has been fashioned by the all-powerful Creator, then the devil also must have been created by the Lord. Footnote: by the word saint, the author is referring to a person who has attained the state of God realization, and does not mean a canonized saint as is commonly understood throughout the Christian world. Editor. End footnote. In the Bible, John 1:3, Christ tells us, "All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." As part of the creation, the devil is also under the orders of the Supreme Father, and is carrying out a task allotted to him. How can this created and subservient power prevail over the Lord? Our confused thinking in this matter has led us astray, for we are used to thinking in terms of worldly power where, for example, a weaker animal might defeat a stronger one. We say someone got in a lucky punch, or he could never have won the fight. But in matters of spirituality, a different law is in operation. Each power in the hierarchy of the creation derives its power and sustenance from the highest power. It is stepped-down power, or power brought down to a lower level of consciousness. Just as the electric current in a home is weak, having been stepped down from the power station, and thence from the generating plant, in a like manner, each presiding power in the universe derives its strength from the one above it. It is completely dependent upon the next higher power for its very existence. Unlike our worldly example, it is not possible for a lesser power to work its will independent of the wishes of the higher power. In mysticism, the question of the devil gaining ascendancy over the Lord does not arise. An integral quality of omnipotence is free will. Certainly, an all-powerful force can do anything it wishes. Just as commanders in the army are given more discretionary power as their rank increases, it is logical that the highest lord is beyond any limitation or restriction and must be able to do whatsoever suits him. To put it another way, free will increases as consciousness is elevated. The higher the degree of consciousness, the more free will is in operation, with the supreme power being the only entity totally free. But as we descend in consciousness, we are moving away from the supreme power and thus suffer a reduction in our free will. On the human level, free will is conditioned and limited by our actions of the past, by our karmas, a topic which we shall discuss later. But for the moment, let us say that freedom from limitation of any kind, that is, free will, seems a logical concomitant of a power that claims to be supreme. We have very briefly examined three of the most important characteristics by which the Lord is described. But we must not overlook the fourth quality, that of universal love. The kind of love referred to here is hard to reduce to the level of words because of the inadequacy of language. When we think of love, we generally envision the love of man for woman, parent for child, or friend for friend. That kind of love, when compared with divine love, is an inferior form and is but a reflection of true love. For the former is based on selfishness, though admittedly a selfishness subtle in nature. For when we love others in the physical world, they must somehow meet our needs and desires, and this becomes part of the reason we are moved to love them. When they cease to meet our needs, we fall out of love, demonstrating the shallowness of such love. If we examine human relationships critically, we will observe that we are always falling in and out of love throughout life. In divine love, all thought of self is forgotten. The object of such a love is that the lover and the beloved become one. On our physical level of consciousness, we attempt to merge and become one through the act of sexual relations. But we find that this kind of merging does not really make us one with another person, although it may bring us emotionally closer to one another. Today, many persons attempt to find a oneness with another person through sexual encounters, but gradually they discover that such love is still rooted in selfishness and in the desire to receive pleasure from another, even though it may also include the desire to please another. But the feelings in this kind of love are rooted in the body, and thus can never take us out of the body to higher spiritual awareness. Even if we are fortunate enough to experience a mental oneness with our partner, we find we cannot give up our own individuality and way of thinking, which is necessary if we are to become truly one with another. Saints tell us that in divine love, individuality ceases and one becomes united with the Lord and the entire creation. As Maharaj Charan Singh puts it, when you are in love with everyone, you are attached to no one. Look at the divine love of such persons as Jesus, Buddha, and Krishna. Each saw divinity in every creature and made no distinction as to caste, creed, color, or religion. The divine lover, having merged himself into the ocean of God, sees everything as God's will. The French have a saying, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, or to understand everything is to forgive everything. If we really understood his plan, we would not even consider criticizing anyone or anything. In the book of Mirdad by Mikhail Naimi, Mirdad says, I often hear you say that love is blind, meaning that it can see no fault in the beloved. That kind of blindness is the height of seeing. Would that you are always so blind as to behold no fault in anything. Nay, clear and penetrating is the eye of love. Therefore, it sees no fault. When love has purged your sight, then would you see nothing at all unworthy of your love. Only a love-shorn, faulty eye is ever busy finding faults. Whatever faults it finds are its own faults. In the Bible, Christ tells us that the Heavenly Father is love, and the Son of God is love. Anyone who has become one with God must experience this divine love or cessation of all duality. Christ gives as his only commandment the injunction to love one another. He stresses that we must imbibe that quality which is derived from the Lord himself. Since God is all love, he is merged into and at one with his creation. It is necessary for us, in order to find God, to believe and accept that such higher love does indeed exist and is an intrinsic characteristic of the Supreme Lord. In the poetry of Sheikh Farid, a Sufi mystic of the 13th century, we read, "Sugar, honey, and buffalo's milk are all sweet, but incomparable is the sweetness of the Lord." It would certainly be unwise for us to worship a God who did not have at least these qualities, all of which are frequently mentioned in the writings of the saints. No doubt he possesses many more qualities which we cannot even imagine through the vehicle of our mind. Indeed, mystics tell us that, technically, he is beyond all attributes, since they are simply products, judgments, and qualities of the mind. The Chinese mystic Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, "There is a being, wonderful, perfect. It existed before heaven and earth. How quiet it is. How spiritual it is. It stands alone, and it does not change. It moves around and around, but does not on this account suffer. All life comes from it. It wraps everything with its love as in a garment, and yet does not demand to be Lord. I do not know its name, and so I call it Tao, the way, and rejoice in its power."